I see the thumbs up. I want to thank everyone for coming. I'm Courtney Matthews, class of 91, and I'm a member of the Council of Lafayette Women, and I'm really pleased to invite or welcome you all here today for our discussion, Body of Truth or Bodies of Truth, however we want to call it. Harriet Brown is here to present to us. She's from the class of 79. And before I make my introduction to her, I just want to do some housekeeping. Since we're all here on Zoom, there's some rules and regulations for our Zoom meeting tonight. And first, I just want to thank you for taking your time out of your schedule to join us today, and also to reconnect with Lafayette College, which is what we're all here to do with each other, as well as the college. So first of all, Rachel's here from Lafayette. Most everyone knows Rachel. Rachel and I are co-hosting, and Rachel's in the background making sure that everyone is on permanent mute. So you may not unmute yourself right at this moment, so that Harriet kind of has the floor. Ellen, it makes me want to make a joke about you, wanting to unmute but not being able to. So later, perhaps. We are going to have Q&A. In the beginning, while Harriet's giving her presentation, I encourage you to put a message in the chat. And as we get to the end of the presentation, provided our group stays about this size, we can unmute and have a little bit more of a richer conversation. We're expecting Q&A to take up the last 20 minutes or so of today's presentation. And also, if you were on the meeting last night, Ellen described how, but if you want to add your class year, I think a lot of folks have it next to your name. If you go up to your 3 dots, scroll down to the rename function, and you add your class name to it, it's nice to see what class everyone is in who's joining us tonight. Up in the upper right-hand corner, there's gallery view and speaker view. If you choose speaker view, you'll be able to see the person who's talking. You can wait till I'm done. You don't have to do it now. Wait till Harriet speaks. But then you'll make the speaker the primary frame in your screen. And then also want everyone to know that we're recording tonight's presentation. So if you have any objections, take yourself off video, because it will be shared with the greater Lafayette community later. And now I want to take a minute and introduce Harriet to y'all. She is here joining us from Syracuse. It's where she lives and also where she works. There she is. She is a professor of magazine news and digital journalism at the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. And she does a lot of speaking across the country at college campuses. All the different publications she's written for include the New York Times Science section, New York Times Magazine, Psychology Today, Scientific American, and other publications. Her most recent book is A Shadow Daughter, a Memoir of Estrangement. And she's also written a book called Body of Truth, How Science, History, and Culture Drive Our Obsession with Weight. And that's kind of the framework of our conversation today. She also wrote a book, What We Can Do About It, and Brave Girl Eating, A Family Struggle with Anorexia, which won a Books for Better Life Award. And in 2011, she won the University of Iowa's John F. Murray Prize in Strategic Communications for the Public Good for her work as an advocate for those with eating disorders. So Harriet, thanks for all your good work, and welcome, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I like to run this a bit informally. It's a little harder on Zoom, but if you have a question while I'm going along, just pop it in the chat box and someone will ask it verbally, or you can wait till the end and then you'll have a chance to ask me yourself. So I'm going to share my screen and start with a little bit of a PowerPoint. And this is just the framework for what we're really talking about here is diet culture. And so it's based on this book, Body of Truth, How Science, History, and Culture Drive Our Obsession with Weight and What We Can Do About It. And I was inspired to write this book for a lot of reasons. My own history growing up at a time when, there was intense pressure on, especially on women, to be thin, to look a certain way, to behave a certain way too. And the worst thing you could possibly say to someone when I was a kid and a young adult was, you're fat, she's fat. That was like the worst insult you could possibly offer to someone. And that background was part of it. I'll get into my own background a little bit too as I go along. But it's the entire culture is basically obsessed with issues of weight and issues of fatness, even though we know, as this amazing pair of photographs shows, these are by Howard Schatz, is a photographer, and he has documented, these are all Olympic athletes. And I love these photos because you can see the reality that people come in all shapes and sizes, right? That's just how we come. There's not one way that we're all supposed to look. We are built on a lot of different models, and these are all athletes at the top of their sport, and yet they're intensely different from each other. We also know that very few of us are born with the genetic material to ever look this way, no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try. But that doesn't stop us from feeling like we're supposed to look this way, right? For a variety of reasons. But, I've been struck by so many of the statistics that have come out around how do we feel about our bodies, right? And they're deeply disturbing if you actually look at them. I think Glamour magazine did a survey a few years ago and found that 97% of the young women they surveyed said they felt hatred toward their bodies at least once a day, which is a lot. That's a lot. There have been studies looking at, when does the fear of getting fat begin? And they've found it in girls as young as 3. And something like 80% of 10-year-olds have already been on at least one diet. So, and I think it's not different in terms of this phenomenon from when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. I do think it starts much younger now, in part because kids are exposed to media so much earlier, but not just because of media, right? But we'll get to that in a minute. But I grew up in a household where my mother was always on a diet, right? She had a scale in her bathroom. She had a chart on the wall over her scale, and every morning she got on that scale and faithfully recorded her weight. She and I went on my first diet with my mother. I was 14 or 15. We went to Weight Watchers together, and she then went on to become a Weight Watchers lecturer. And when she died a few years ago in her 70s, she was, as she had been for most of her life, still on a diet. So that, for so many of us, that became, and for a while, it was how I lived too, right? Dieting worked for me. I lost that weight when I was 15, and then I regained it, as something like 90% of people do. And then I lost it again, and I regained it, and I lost it again, and I regained it. By the time I was in my late 30s, I was absolutely miserable about my weight. I hated myself. I hated my body. I had a great life, a great husband, 2 daughters who I loved, work that I loved, but I was so busy hating my body that it was actually hard for me to pay attention to any of that. So I signed up for a 10-week session with a therapist who ran an eating program that was supposed to help people like me, right? So in my eyes, I needed help whipping my body into shape. I needed to be punished. I needed to be castigated, inspired. Give me some tools. I'm going to get hold of this, right? I'm going to get my body in line. And so I'm just going to read to you a little bit from, this is the paperback version of the book, from the introduction, because that sort of sets things up. It's called How My Life Changed with One Sentence. On a sticky summer evening, I sit in a chair in a therapist's office and cry. My body, I tell her, is too fleshy, too hungry, too uncontained. It doesn't look like the bodies I see 500 times a day, online, on TV, in magazines. It doesn't look the way it's supposed to, the way I want it to. There have been years when it did, when I weighed and measured and wrote down everything I ate, worked out twice a day, pummeled my body into shape. But inevitably, it reverts to its natural state. like now, when it's 30 or 40 pounds heavier than I want it to be, than I feel like it should be. So I'm here because I want someone to fix me, specifically to tell me how to regain control of my body. I hope this therapist is going to teach me how to control my appetite again, something I was better at in my 20s. But now, more than a decade later, after 3 pregnancies and a whole lot of living, I just can't seem to do it anymore. So I sit in the chair, leaking tears of self-pity, and wait for her to break out the Kleenex and reassure me that, yes, it's okay. She'll help me lose weight. We will take care of this together. She does hand me a box of tissues, but she doesn't murmur soothingly. Instead, she leans back in her chair and looks at me. This woman in her 50s with spiky dark hair, a soft stomach, and stocky legs bridges the space between us with an expression I can't quite read. Pity, sorrow, judgment. Sweat slides down the back of my neck as I wait for her to save me. And then she says something unimaginable, something that will change my life, though I don't know it yet. What if you were okay with your body the way it is right now? She asks. I stare at her. What I want to say is, are you nuts? I mean, that's why I'm here, because I'm not okay with it. Does she want me to have a heart attack or a stroke or get diabetes because I'm too fat? Does she know how much time I've wasted crying in front of the mirror? Does she think I want to look like her for the rest of my life? Of course, I've never considered the possibility of being okay with this body, this unacceptable body, and I'm not going to consider it. That would be letting myself go, as my grandmother used to say, shaking her head, about any woman who'd gained a few pounds. Even as a child, I knew what she'd meant. They'd stopped caring about themselves and they'd stopped taking care of themselves. And now they deserved exactly what they got from my grandmother and every other woman in their social circle: censure, gossip, and pity. I will never let myself go. I will never, ever, ever be the sloppy, lazy, dull, fat friend or mother or relative people like my grandmother shake their heads about. So that was kind of the beginning of my experience with even contemplating this. I found that my reaction to this therapist was rage, rage, but I didn't leave, I stayed. And I wound up actually working with her for 10 years. And it was life-changing and life-affirming. And, I can honestly say that I'm not sure I'd be alive today if it wasn't for the work that I did. That's how deep my self-hatred ran. And the thing is, I wasn't unique in that, right? I think so many of us struggle with that on a daily basis, and we can't even articulate it to ourselves. So I set out on a journey of exploration. I wanted to understand this thing, that we talk about. What are we talking about when we talk about, being overweight? A word that I don't like to use, which, words really matter. So the word overweight suggests that there's a weight you're supposed to be at and you're over it, right? So that's a word I don't like. Similarly, the word obese, which has become a medical diagnosis, but also has so many connotations of, people who are obese are considered to be all of the things I said in my intro, right? Lazy, stupid, unrestrained, fill in the blank, every negative connotation you could associate with that. A lot of people, including myself, like the word fat. It's simply a description. And so that's the word that I will use. So just so you understand where I'm coming from. So I wanted to understand this connection between weight and health and what does it all mean? Because in our culture today, they are inextricably bound, right? The public discourse around weight often focuses primarily on health, right? These are the terrible things that are going to happen to you. Obesity epidemic, it's killing the children, it's killing all of us. None of us are going to live, I've read all kinds of stuff. Our children's generation is going to die before we do, and add to that, it's a matter of personal responsibility, right? If you are considered overweight or obese, it's your fault. And it's up to you to fix it, right? And in fact, we've seen that with this COVID-19 epidemic when some of the states opened up the vaccines to both people who smoked and people with BMIs over 30, both of which are seen as risk factors for more severe disease. People started hollering, what? That's, they made those choices, not about smoking, but about fatness, right, as a risk factor. So, it runs deep and it's very insidious. And we also assume that whatever health problems we have are caused by weight. And in researching and writing this book, I did interviews with a lot of people. There's about 50 stories included in the book, personal stories of people. And so many of them were about situations like this. I mean, this is almost funny, but it's not, because it happens so often. I've heard people say, I went to doctors repeatedly for many years with this abdominal pain. All they told me was to lose weight. It turned out I had cancer and I could have died. Many stories like that. So, and the advice is always, well, you're too fat, lose weight. And how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by dieting. So, and I do like this quote, whoever came up with the idea of making dieting about health is brilliant. Now you're not shallow if you focus all your attention on dieting, you're righteous. And that's the way we talk about it too, right? We use these terms that have all this moral weight and moral value. Oh, I ate a piece of chocolate cake, I was bad. Oh, I ate a salad, I was good. There's this rhetoric that is really suited much more toward religion than toward dieting, but I would suggest that dieting has become our religion. I am seeing some shifts now, which make me very happy. That I think, my students and the younger generations are perhaps seeing other options, but certainly dieting is still very much something that's recommended to people by medical professionals. Oops, let's get this. So I thought we would take a quick trip through some historical diets. Right, they're almost cute, right? Like this was literally tapeworms, okay, that women would swallow on purpose. And I love the word sanitized, right? That sort of suggests, oh, this is medical. This is all safe. This is, but imagine women have been encouraged to swallow tapeworms to lose weight. Smoking has long been, something that women were encouraged to do and did in large numbers as a weight control thing. In fact, I know that both my grandmother and mother smoked for that reason specifically, right? The cabbage soup diet also used to be known as the stewardess's diet, because women who were flight attendants back in the day had to make these weight categories and were not allowed to, if you went over your weight category, you could be fired basically. So yeah, the more soup you eat, the more weight you should lose, basically, because after 2 days of eating nothing but cabbage soup, you lose your will to live and you're not going to eat anything. So that's the end of that. This was a good one. Some of you probably remember this. AIDS candies, right? I remember it. You were supposed to eat 1 or 2 of these before every meal, and then you wouldn't have an appetite. And these went out of fashion with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 80s because of their name, but they were useless. I can tell you that from personal experience. Jaw wiring, which is something that is still done. There's a dentist in Brooklyn who still does it, and I interviewed him a few years ago for a story, and I asked him, well, how effective is this? And he said, well, as long as your jaws are wired together, it's very effective. But the minute you unwire them, people just gain all the weight back. Of course they do, because you can eat again, right? This was big a while ago, maybe 15 years ago. I think it's LE. So medication that you should be able to take to make you lose weight. The thing is, how it works is it basically ruins your digestive system and you wind up pooping uncontrollably, and it's not a very pleasant medication to be on. Plus, let's face it, the minute you stop taking it, you're going to gain back the few pounds. I mean, what's fascinating about some of this research is, like, when they study things like this, the people who took this medication, which was approved by the FDA, versus the people who didn't take it, maybe lost 4 or 5 pounds more than the control group. But we're so desperate to lose weight, to become thinner, to have that magic answer that, it's sold very well. And then there's the tongue patch, right? Which literally involves getting a patch like this sewn onto your tongue so that eating becomes very painful. We'll get off of that because that's a really unpleasant one to look at. That's a quick jaunt through dieting. One of the terms that you come into contact with immediately when you start thinking about this stuff is BMI. And obviously we all know about BMI because your doctor records your BMI every time you go. You know, there's calculators online, you know, figure out your BMI. And there are these categories, which you see on here. And I don't know how much you guys know about BMI, but it's all it is a ratio between height and weight. That's all it is. It doesn't really, it was developed in the 19th century by a mathematician. It was never intended as an individual measure of health in any way. It can't tell you, you know, how much you exercise or how nutritious your diet is. It can't tell you what your body composition is. It can't tell you your disease risk factors. It's a simple mathematical equation. And it's extremely inaccurate, especially for women, short people, and African-American people. So, you know, the fact that it is applied willy-nilly across all categories as this sort of proxy for health is very disturbing. And in fact, this study at UCLA found that when you do that, which we do all the time and which your doctor does, you know, at least 75 million Americans are being misdiagnosed. And the misdiagnoses run on both ends of the spectrum. So a lot of people are told they are unhealthy because their BMI is over, you know, 25. And I can tell you from personal experience that the opposite is also true, that people who are underweight, you know, are often told how wonderful they are and how healthy they are. And some of the kinds of health problems that they have are often missed. So that is deeply problematic. And we've been taught to assume that this relationship between BMI and health is linear, right? So in other words, the higher your BMI, the more unhealthy you are until you die, the end. That is not true at all. In fact, the curve looks like this. What's what we call a U-shaped curve. Some people call it a J-shaped curve. And what you see if you look at this is that it's the people on the two extreme ends of the spectrum whose health risks are increased. So people with BMIs under about 20, which includes some people in the so-called normal range of BMI, they have higher health risks. And then, you know, people whose BMI is about over 40 or so. But what's interesting about this curve is that the lowest health risks are for people in what we would consider the overweight to mildly obese category. So, you know, this is not something that we talk about. This is not something that doctors tell you, and this is not something that we've internalized either. And it gets very complicated, but the result of all of this is that we live in a culture that is very, very fat hating, right? So people who are perceived as too fat are discriminated against in pretty much every situation you could imagine: the doctor's office, employment, you know, social situations, in the built environment, in the workplace, everywhere. And so that is deeply problematic. And why is it problematic? We're going to look at that. But first, I wanted to show you this. This was a meme that went around a few years ago. And it was this picture of a heart and this caption: "This is the heart of an obese person. Remember, folks, this is what happens when you get fat. Fat tissue builds up around the heart and clogs, chokes it. Fat is not beautiful. It is not to be glorified." Only one problem. This is a perfectly healthy heart. This is what a heart is supposed to look like, actually. This is not a heart that's too fat. This is not a diseased heart. But the fear that's inspired by an image like this is pervasive. And I can tell you, because I have felt that myself as well, right? Oh my God, you know, this idea that we're doing something terrible to ourselves. So a few other examples of the kind of weight stigma and fat phobia that is so rampant in this culture. This was a tweet that got a lot of attention some years ago. this guy, who was a PhD professor somewhere, dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. #truth. And at this point, I've heard so many personal stories from people who have lived this that I know 100% that this is true. This is the kind of photograph that often accompanies news stories about the, quote, obesity epidemic. The sociologist Charlotte Cooper named these. She calls these headless fatty shots. And if you actually start paying attention, you will notice how many shots of people who are fat are shown like this: no head, sitting in a chair that's too small, or eating. Often people are eating, and always with no face, because the point is to dehumanize, right? These are not people in this narrative. They are examples of this moral disease, this, terrible thing. They are, greedy. They are whatever negative associations we can put on them. They're always shown like this. There are lots and lots and lots of examples of advertisements that use weight stigma and fat phobia. This was just one example. The sooner you advertise here, the better. The implication being, otherwise you have to look at this body that is so obviously wrong, unattractive, that it's going to incentivize you to buy an ad here in our outdoor billboard. Oops, we'll go back one. Yeah, and these are pervasive ads. PETA is very well known, in fact, for doing a lot of these kind of ads, because PETA is not afraid to get in your face on a lot of fronts. But they ran an ad a few years ago that was something like, I forget the actual wording, but the insinuation was, when the aliens from outer space come to take us away, they're going to take the fat ones first. It's like, wow, you can find a way to work fat phobia into any and every conversation. And so, all of this led me to think, well, okay, but what if they're right? Like, what, there are studies that suggest, that it's worse for your health to be fat. And, aside from the sort of stigma and the sort of beauty issue of it. But when I started researching this, I came to understand a fundamental truth, which was that if you're going to study the relationship between weight and health, you have to take into account the effects of living with weight stigma and fat phobia, because they change people's health, right? This, in the same way that, living in poverty or living with racism, we know that these have fundamental effects on people's physical and psychological health. So does the situation of living in a culture that hates fatness while you are considered fat. So, for example, some of the, I'm just going to move that around. Some of the interesting research on this is that we know that experiencing weight discrimination actually increases your risk of early death. It increases your risk of heart disease, right? So very often when these studies are done, they say, oh, look, fat people get more heart attacks, they die earlier. But we actually can't tell if it's because you're fat or if it's because you live in such a fat-hating culture. Okay. We know that people who internalize weight stigma have higher levels of cortisol than those who don't. Cortisol is that stress hormone that, you're not supposed to live with high levels of cortisol. That also diminishes health. And we know that people who internalize weight bias, in other words, it's not just the world saying to you, you're too fat, do something about it. It's you saying it to yourself. That's where it really hits you. That negatively affects your physical and psychological health. So stigma itself, is actually a huge part of the problem. And yet we don't talk about that. We know that also the more people experience weight stigma, the lower their motivation toward health behaviors, right? The less likely they are to eat nutritiously, to exercise, to take care of their bodies, which makes sense, because if you feel shitty about yourself, you're not inclined to want to take care of yourself. And, so I also grew up thinking that, well, okay, and this is something you still hear from doctors. well, look, any weight you can lose is good, even if you gain it back. It's always better to be trying to lose weight. Dieting is benign, it can't hurt you. But actually, that's not true. We also know now that intentional weight loss, and especially when people lose weight and regain it, lose weight and regain it, which is normally what happens, that messes up your physical health. And the way we know that is by looking at specific health markers like blood pressure, fasting blood glucose, cholesterol. And researchers who looked at this found no health improvements with weight loss. Now, this doesn't mean that for every single person who loses weight, there's no health improvements, right? Part of the message of this is that health is pretty individual. And what you might need to make yourself healthier might be different from what I need. But what it means is that weight loss as a prescription across all people and all situations, there's actually no reason for it. My husband is a case in point. He's weighed the same thing since he was 20 years old. He's always been wiry and thin, and he developed high blood pressure. He went to the doctor. The first thing the doctor said to him was lose weight. And then he kind of like looked at him and said, oh, never mind. Lose weight is the first thing that's going to be said to you. It's so reflexive, right? And he just looked at him like, okay. I had radicalized him by then, so he knew what to say. So what's the alternative? And one of the alternatives is something called health at every size, which I don't know. See, if we were all in a room together, I could say how many people have heard of health at every size, and you could tell me. But health at every size is another framework for considering the relationship between weight and health. So it is a weight neutral approach toward health, right? What does that mean? That means that this automatic assumption that we make that fatness equals ill health and thinness equals good health, we just try to take that out of the equation. So instead of looking at how much somebody weighs to consider their health, we look at other things. We look at, their blood pressure. We look at their resting heart rate. We look at their exercise capability. We look at, all kinds of things like that that are actually much more valid measures of health. It focuses on health behaviors, not body size, right? So again, what you do rather than what you are. And it celebrates body diversity. And if you have a chance, there's a great 3-minute video online. You can look it up. It's called Poodle Science, poodle like the dog. And it's basically about health at every size. And it really gives a great little nutshell description of it. So I don't have time to show it now, unfortunately, but it's really pretty fantastic. I can't see if there are any questions right now, so I'm just going to take a quick pause. Are there any questions? Anything anyone wants to ask right now? We're almost to our actual Q&A time. Actually, we are to our Q&A time. Okay, so I'm going to stop the formal part of the presentation just with this image, which I love, which is basically about, take up space in the world. Don't let yourself get pushed into this idea that you have to look a certain way. And obviously that's easy to say, very hard to do. And we can talk more about that if anyone has a question. So questions, this is the time. Don't be shy.
I'll ask.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Beautiful presentation. I'm very involved in a 12-step group that's called Overeaters Anonymous. And it's not just for overeaters, it's the whole range. It's how we control and enjoy our addiction of food. And a lot of what is discussed is you just have bad willpower. You're just not trying hard enough. And where are you with the idea that this is an addiction as well? Because much of what you spoke to can speak to that as well. It worked nicely. Mm-hmm. So where are you with the idea that it can be an addiction for some people who are addicted to food or exercise, bulimia, etc.?
Well, I'm addicted to oxygen. I'm going to just admit that right now. Like, I have to breathe. If I don't breathe, I get very nervous and, I faint and whatever. I mean, we have to eat food. I personally, like, I would never critique anyone else's take on this, but I personally have a big problem with the idea of food as an addiction. I think that what I think is really at the heart of people's issues with food is that we are taught from such a young age to not trust our own bodies and to not trust our own sense of hunger and satiety, and when you learn from such an early age, when your parents or I mean, I ate Friday night dinners with a grandfather I love dearly, but everything he said to me was always, are you sure you want butter on that bread? Like, when you learn that you can't trust your body and you can't trust your own feelings of hunger and fullness, then you lose the ability to do that. And then I think people get into real trouble with this stuff because I need someone else to tell me, what am I supposed to eat? I think that so many issues with food would be solved or made better by learning to tune into your body. So I'm sure that especially some of the younger people on this Zoom have heard of intuitive eating, right? And it's a way of, again, tuning into yourself and your own hunger and fullness cues and following them and trusting your body. Bodies are in a state of homeostasis, right? They're meant to sort of keep themselves stable. And so I think it's really problematic when we start thinking about food as an addiction.
Harriet, we have a couple questions in the chat.
Mhm.
First one being, how do you navigate conversations with family members who practice extreme policing around body and food?
Oh boy, that is a tough one. And I've experienced this from both sides, right? So from myself, as I always felt too fat when I was a kid. I mean, looking back at pictures, I think I was fairly normal looking, but I mean, my family used to get together and like their big topic of conversation would be, how many Weight Watchers points is in that? And how many are in this? And then I had a daughter who developed anorexia. And so then we experienced it from the other side. And it's really, really tough. I tried talking to my family members. I tried, talking to them ahead of time, giving them scripts to follow. Eventually I told my family, like, please do not say anything about anyone's, because if they didn't say something to my daughter, then they'd say something about themselves. Oh my God, I'm so fat. I have to lose 10 pounds. This is like the worst. Please do not talk about food and appearance and eating and weight. And that's something that I practice in my life now because, I have friends who are on a different page than me and they'll talk about whatever. They'll be trashing their bodies or they'll be talking about diets or whatever. And I just kind of make it a rule, like, please don't talk about that in front of me. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So that's tough. Families are, it's funny because often when I talk to young people about this, they make an assumption that media is the cause of most of this. But in my personal experience, a lot of it comes from families. And I think partly because it has more power when it comes from someone you love and who loves you and who's supposed to have your best interests at heart, but they're telling you you're not good enough, you're not okay. So, for anyone who's struggling with that, you have my empathy. And I would strongly recommend, if you're on Facebook, there's a Health at Every Size Facebook group that's really great for things like this and for support around issues like that. So check them out.
That's great, Harriet. Thank you. It's a good recommendation. We have a question from Katrina, my classmate.
Mhm.
Can you comment on the current obsession with exercise and body image?
Yes. I mean, yes, there is an obsession. And I don't know if you mean current, like during the pandemic, or if you're just talking about sort of in a broader way. You can unmute yourself and talk to me if you want to.
Can you hear me? I'm on my phone. Can you hear
Yeah, I
me?
can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So I feel like there's been a shift. I work with a lot of young people, and I think there's been a shift away from the dieting per se to, oh, I'm being healthy, and being obsessive about their weight in the form of exercise. So that makes it okay because of that. I liked how you pointed out the whole health aspect of it.
Mhm.
So I think in their minds, it's a healthy thing.
Right. Yes, I
But to
would.
me, it feels like disordered in the same way that compulsively dieting, and that sort of thing. But I'm just curious your thoughts.
Oh, I would totally agree with you. And I, have had students tell me if I don't work out every single day, like the sky is going to fall down and I can't cope, and it's really horrible. So I think that exercise has become a sort of more socially acceptable form of purging, ridding yourself of unwanted calories. And I think that, again, as long as we're framing all of these conversations around health, as long as we're sort of buying into the framework of healthism, right, which sort of says it's your moral obligation to be as healthy as possible, otherwise you're not a worthwhile human being, then I think we're going to wind up with issues like that. But I also think, yeah, it's the same, because I've talked to my students a lot about this stuff. And ultimately, what it comes down to is, sure, you're saying all this, and there's other people who are saying this, but the reality is, if I weigh 10 pounds too much, I can't get a guy won't be interested in me, or a woman won't be interested in me. Like I won't have the same kind of social life. And so it's very, very hard to go against the mainstream on something like this. You have to have a lot of, I don't know, you have to have a lot of support is really what you have to have. So I agree with you, and it's very disturbing. And I think if we could change some of the rhetoric around health and exercise and take away some of this moral overlay of you must work out or else you're a terrible person, then I think some of that would help. But yeah, I agree, it's a problem.
And Harriet, there's another question that might be a good follow-up.
Mhm.
When you talk about what you need, right, in order to kind of offset that pressure.
Mhm.
Annika asked, what are your tips for practicing radical self-love? So
Mhm.
self-love is probably one of those solutions.
Mhm. It is indeed. And there's a lot of great books out there that I would recommend. So in addition to mine, you can read Sonia Renee Taylor, who actually wrote a book called, I think it's called Radical Self-Love or something very close to that. So there's books, but one strategy that I think is useful is, because part of what happens when we engage with a lot of media, and especially social media, where young people are editing themselves, so everything you're seeing is not realistic. When we look at images like that all the time, we're engaged in what sociologists call upward comparison, meaning I'm comparing myself to all of these people that I perceive as higher than me on this sort of food chain of attractiveness, thinness, whatever. And when you only see a certain kind of image, that becomes normalized. So one strategy is to practice downward comparison. And all that means is make sure that your social media feeds are full of different kinds of images. So for example, there are hashtags on Instagram. There's one that I follow that I really like called hashtag fashion, like fashion with a T in the middle to make the word fat. And there you're going to see men and women and non-binary people of all shapes and sizes rocking these incredible outfits. I love that because it helps me remember that there's more than one way that you can be fashionable and that you can look wonderful and that you can show off your sense of style. So I think those are a couple of, places to start, let's say.
All right, our next question is from Melanie. If you're comfortable sharing, how did you approach your daughter's anorexia and what did you learn from it?
Oh, do you have 5 hours? I could tell you what I learned from it. I learned a lot. Sadly, some of what I learned was how messed up our culture is around food. How did I approach it? I didn't know anything about eating disorders when my daughter got sick. And so I approached it like a journalist at first, like I'm going to research the hell out of this and I'm going to figure out what we should do. And I really did not like what I found. I really did not like it because what I found was well, your daughter's going to be sick for a really long time. She's probably never going to get over this. She's going to be in and out of hospitals for the next 20 years of her life. You know, it's going to suck, basically. And I was like, nope, nope, that's not happening to my daughter. Not if I have anything to say about it. So our family did something a little different. We, at that time, because this was 15 years ago now, you didn't hear much about family-based treatment. Now you hear more about it, but it's basically instead of sending my daughter away somewhere, we kept her at home. We refed her with a therapist and doctors, you know, support. And we basically tried to, one of the eating disorder specialists I love most in the world calls it love bombing, and just like love bomb the hell out of her and just like surround her with good food and support and love. And, you know, and I'm happy to say that she's completely recovered, has been for a while, and is now living her best life in New York City. But one of the biggest lessons I learned from it, because, you know, as I said earlier, I'd always come at this whole weight issue from my own place of insecurity about my body. You know, at the beginning of her illness, when she was deathly ill and gaunt and, you know, really looked ill, I could not believe how many people would literally, women always, walk up to her on the street and say, you look so amazing. You know, you could model. Like, wow, what's your secret? You know, and I wanted to like kill them all, you know. And as she recovered and started to gain weight, all of that stopped, you know. So in a way, that was like society reinforcing, right? And I think that it's not like the people who did that were terrible people. We don't even know we're doing it most of the time. And that's why I think a big part of this is just to become aware of this stuff. Or, you know, during her recovery, part of our goal was to feed her. She had to eat a lot of calories to recover because your metabolism gets very messed up when you're very sick with anorexia. So we were always out for the highest calorie foods, you know, so we could get her the most calories in the smallest footprint, basically. And toward the end of her recovery, she was on board with this. And I remember one night we were at the grocery store, we were shopping for ice cream because she would have this giant milkshake every day as part of her recovery plan. And we were kind of joking around. It was late at night, we were goofy, and I was like, oh no, this one's not good enough. Only 150 calories in a half cup. And then she'd be like, oh, look, this one's got 200. And at a certain point, I realized that people were staring at us with such intense disapproval. It was like, wow. And that again was one of those moments for me where I was like, wow, this culture is messed up way beyond what I even thought that it was. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Our next question from Ellen. How do you reconcile telling people that they can be healthy at various weight points, but our society says that men will only love you or find you attractive if you're thin as a social X-ray?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think these are mutually exclusive, obviously, right? Because for one thing, health and social capital are two different things. So the health thing is separate. I think what you're really asking about is the social capital. And I think that the answer is, yeah, there's some people who are going to judge you that way, and some men who will not find you attractive, or women who will not find you attractive if you're too fat. But there's plenty who will, you know, but it's like anything else. If you're a redhead, there are some people who might not find you attractive and others who would. So I think for me, the goal is to just have body size be just another one of those individual characteristics that, sure, some people like this, other people like that. I like chocolate, you like vanilla, like, and in reality, you know, as a person who's, I mean, I've talked to a lot of men about this, and most of them are like, I wouldn't want to be with a woman who's super, super thin. Wow, that would be painful, you know, but I mean, obviously there's men who would want to be. So there's a huge range in individual human preferences. And, you know, I think that's just how it is. But are you going to get that overarching social critique? Yeah, you probably will.
From Nina, how would you approach directing the idea of eating more than your body needs because it's being used as a coping or a social mechanism?
Yeah, that's a great question because
And
I
let
think
me just say, Wendy asked next, what do you say about emotional eating? And I think those two go hand in hand.
they do. And, we have made that such a dirty word and such a terrible concept. And even the way that's phrased, like the idea of eating more than your body needs, that suggests that we only eat out of sheer, the need to fuel ourselves. But that's not what food is to us. Food is a lot of different things to human beings, right? It's connection with others. Like another thing I learned when my daughter was sick was because her feelings about food were it was so hard for her to sit at a meal. It was so hard for her to eat. We went like a whole year without eating with other people. And I realized how much social connection happens around food. And I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with food as a comforting mechanism. I think, again, the problem comes when your relationship with food becomes disordered and interrupted to the point where that's all you're doing. I'm only eating out of comfort. Then you've got a different kind of issue. Or, I'm only eating out of boredom or whatever. But I think Ellen Satter, who's a wonderful writer about these issues, she describes normal eating as a kind of, it encompasses all of these things. It encompasses sometimes eating too much, so you're uncomfortably full, and sometimes eating not quite enough, so you're hungry, and sometimes eating because you're sad, and sometimes eating because you're with friends, and sometimes just eating because you love the taste of something and you want to have another bite of it. Like, I think that's okay. I think that's all what we talk about when we talk about food. So emotional eating, I would say it's part of the range of normal eating and our normal relationship with food. And that we have just sort of turned it into this terrible idea.
Margaret raised her hand, so she
Mhm.
wants to ask you a question.
Margaret.
Yes, thank you, Harriet, for sharing your personal story. So I was raised in a very similar household as you and was adamant to not raise my girls with critiquing everything. And yet somehow they still have inherited much of my, I'm too heavy, I've got to get back on a diet, and that roller coaster. And I realized that although it wasn't said directly to them, I was guilty of throwing on a dress and saying, oh, I look too fat, I can't wear this, and, being discouraged. And even though I protected them from the direct comments, like what you heard from your grandfather, that's what I heard. We'd walk through the living room and he'd be like, so you've gained a little weight since I saw you last. I mean, it was just constant.
Yes.
And that was mom, dad, and grandparents and aunts and uncles. So, and I look back and my sisters and I were tiny, but we just didn't even know we were tiny. I look back at pictures and I just don't know how to change. They're in their 20s now. And I've really been trying to help them not focus on that as much. But I think a lot of it's my own internal messaging to myself. So how did you change that message to yourself?
I'm still changing it. I'm still changing it. It's here's the thing, like when that old joke about the fish in the water, right? Two fish are swimming around and one says to the other, oh, the water's nice today. And the other one looks at him and says, what's water? It's like when you're swimming in it, you don't know what it is. You don't recognize it. You just think that's how it is. So when we all live in a fat phobic culture, of course we all internalize this, just as we all live in a racist culture, and of course we internalize these things. Like that's part of your job when you're a child, is to understand and take in all of these ideas that society is telling you. You need to be like this, you need to do this, you need to think this way. So I think first of all, the blame that you have for yourself, you could maybe let go of some of that, right? Like, this is a fat phobic culture. This is a highly judgy culture. I mean, I've said things, we all mess up sometimes, right? That doesn't cause a daughter's illness or obsession or whatever, disordered eating or whatever it is. It's the culture at large. So I think that what you can do is support them in understanding that this is a fat phobic culture, that there are other ways to be. Here's some interesting ideas to explore. And, I had to really work on as you say, the hard thing isn't not critiquing them, it's not critiquing yourself, because somehow that's also part of how we were socialized, certainly in my generation, that self-deprecation makes you a better person in some way, and makes you, and that it's okay to do. And I certainly did some of that in front of my girls before I realized, oh my God, what am I teaching them? So, it's a systemic oppression that we deal with. So none of us can solve it on our own. We can do things that make it a little bit better, and we can work toward change in a bigger way, which is kind of what I'm trying to do by giving talks like this.
All right, Harriet, I am actually turning the microphone over to Rachel, since, as I mentioned, I do have a hard stop. So I'm going to take my leave, but thank you so much. And thanks to everyone. I know we have a couple more questions in the chat. So I'll kick off Carolyn's question, and then Rachel's going to pick up from here. Do you have advice for young women, like my 18-year-old daughter, who feels pressure to be thin and make a perfect photo on social media? My daughter's at normal weight, but she thinks she's fat. I tell her she's beautiful, but she doesn't believe me.
Right. This is something I hear from students all the time, and it's a lot easier to hear it from students, honestly, than to hear it from your daughter, right? For one thing, students will actually listen to you when you say something, and daughters don't listen to their mothers, right? But I mean, again, there genuinely is a lot of pressure on her. So it's not like she's imagining this or making it up. And so I think part of it is to validate that, like, yes, there is pressure on you. When I was growing up, there wasn't social media, and there certainly wasn't Instagram and filters and all of that stuff. So to validate that, and then to maybe help her expand her vision. So, finding some amazing role models, and if anyone wants to email me afterwards, I'll put my email in the chat, and I can help you with more specific stuff. But, finding some role models on Instagram, and on Twitter and whatever social media, and on TikTok, who actually show other ways to be, right? Women in larger bodies who talk about that, who are just themselves unapologetically. I think that's probably the best you can do, validate and help her expand. And I'm just going to put my email in here right now, so that I'm happy to help anybody or talk to anybody about any of this off Zoom.
Great. Thank you, Harriet. All right, it's Rachel. We did the pass behind the scenes. I just want to make sure, because I'm going back in the chat here. I don't know if we got to Tara's question, which was, how do you think fatness is related to self-worth? Did we do that one?
We did not.
Yeah, okay, great. That's from Tara.
Well, I think, again, because we live in such a fat phobic culture, that it becomes a way for us to feel bad about ourselves, right? But I think about it like one of many sort of standards that we hold ourselves to, right? It happens to be a very powerful one, but I think that our feelings of self-worth, I think we all struggle with having them come from outside ourselves versus coming from inside ourselves. And if it's coming from outside yourself, you can find a lot of ways to feel terrible about yourself. So I guess I don't know, like, tell me more if there's more behind that question, but I mean, that would be what sort of pops to mind.
Right, I'm not sure, Tara, if you have follow-up to that. You could either put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just asking because I think, like, with my struggles with my body image and things, I feel like I always felt like if I was thinner, I would be I would have more worth as a person, and I think it was hard to separate. I'm working on it now, but I think it was hard to separate that I could still be just as worthy and valuable as a person, whether or not I was thin.
Yeah, and there's a sort of corollary to that a lot of us believe that we would be happier. We'd be happier and more worthwhile somehow if we were thin, or if we, in whatever way, conformed to the ideal. I think it sounds like you already know that that's not a direct equation. But it makes sense because, again, that's what society is telling us, right? Because especially for people who are fatter in this culture, are treated by everyone as if they are worthless, as if they are less worthy, as if they are stupid and, insensitive and undisciplined and whatever else. So I think it makes sense that we struggle with those feelings, but I think that it's also possible to overcome them. And I'm glad that you're engaged in the process and the effort.
And I think looks like we have a bunch of thank yous in the chat, but it looks like I have one more question here from Wendy. If my son is overweight, and I know you don't believe such thing exists, what do I do? He has more weight on his body than his doctor says is safe. How do I negotiate this?
Well, I don't know how old your son is, Wendy, but if he's, well, it doesn't.
He's 16.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is you don't negotiate this. This is his body. And I think that the problem isn't his weight. Like, I don't know what else is going on with him, but, there are many reasons why people come in different shapes and sizes. So if there are behaviors that you're seeing that are troubling to you, if he's not exercising at all, or if he's depressed, or if he's anxious, or if he's, got other things going on, those are the things to pay attention to. The problem with trying to intervene with a child or an adolescent or a young adult, frankly, is that even though you do it out of love, what you end up communicating is that you're not okay the way you are. And that is a really tragic message. And I know that, family members who conveyed that to me, again, out of love, they weren't doing it out of negative feelings, that just made me feel worse. So I would suggest that whatever's going on with your son, that you focus on the other issues. What I would suggest are the real issues and not on the weight piece of it.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet. I think that's most of the questions in the chat, and you were kind enough to put your email in there, which we all appreciate. I know there was one comment in the chat, so this is being recorded. We need to do some little editing of that, but it will be sent out to all of you, that video, within the next few days, so everyone has that. It will also be posted on our alumni relations website, where we have all the recordings of, not only will we'll have all the CLW conference recordings, but where we have our recordings for can't believe it, a year of virtual programming that we've had. But really, Harriet, on behalf of the college and on Council of Lafayette Women, thank you so much. This really was phenomenal. And, we all learned so much, I think, about ourselves, those of us like me who has a daughter. We're looking at some things in different ways. And I don't know if you have any final thoughts for the group, but this really has been outstanding.
No, just, this is a lifelong process. I mean, it really is. And so be kind to yourselves, whatever part of the process you are or choose to be engaged in. Just know that, you don't have the terrible thing about social media is that we judge ourselves so harshly. But the great thing about social media is you can actually find support and community, sometimes in surprising places. So I hope that you find some. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. And, please continue to sign up if you haven't already for other CLW sessions. If you go to the Alumni Relations website, Leopard link with a k.lafayette.edu, you'll find them all there. We have other outstanding speakers and panelists over the next 2 weeks, and look forward to when the world changes a bit, Harriet, having you finally come back to campus and get back to Easton. It's been a while. So, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks for your service. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you,
great.
Harriet.
Really good.